The Mafia boss kidnapped a girl, but he didn't expect to fall in love. I always believe that the most dangerous moment in life is not when someone takes your freedom, but when you realize the person who took it is not the monster you expected. On a quiet Thursday evening in late October, Emily Carter stepped out of the small bookstore where she worked on North Clark Street in Chicago, pulling her coat a little tighter as the wind rolled down from Lake Michigan. The neon sign above the shop flickered softly behind her while the city moved through its usual rhythm of headlights, distant sirens, and the steady hum of traffic stretching toward downtown. Emily had worked late organizing a shipment of new novels, the kind of quiet task she enjoyed after most customers had already gone home. At 24 years old, she had built a simple life for herself in the city, one that revolved around early morning coffee, long walks through Lincoln Park, and the comfort of stories printed on old paper. She never imagined that an ordinary evening like this one could quietly step off the path of normal life and into something far stranger. As she walked toward the train station 2 blocks away, she noticed a black sedan parked near the corner. The car looked expensive, the kind people in Chicago often associate with businessmen or politicians who prefer privacy. Emily barely gave it a second thought until the rear door opened, and 2 men stepped out with calm and deliberate movements that felt strangely rehearsed. There was nothing loud or chaotic about the moment. No shouting, no rushing, just the quiet certainty that something unusual was unfolding around her. One of the men spoke her name in a polite voice that carried the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Emily stopped walking, confusion crossing her face because she had never seen either of them before. The taller man explained that there had been a misunderstanding and that someone important wished to speak with her immediately. The way he said it felt less like a request and more like a carefully worded instruction. Before Emily could decide what to say next, the door of the sedan opened wider, revealing the dark interior where another figure waited silently. The man inside did not step out right away. Instead, he simply watched. The scene with the quiet composure of someone used to controlling every detail in a room without raising his voice. His name was Adrian Romano, though Emily did not know that yet. In certain circles of Chicago, the name carried the weight of power and reputation, the kind of reputation people discussed in lowered voices at private dinners or behind closed office doors. Adrian Romano was known as a man who built an empire from strategy rather than noise, someone whose presence alone could shift the direction of a conversation. When he finally stepped out of the sedan, the streetlight above the corner illuminated his calm expression and dark-tailored coat. There was nothing dramatic about him, nothing that resembled the ruthless figure Emily might have imagined if she had heard the stories whispered across the city. He simply looked like a man who had already thought 10 steps ahead of everyone else around him. Adrian studied Emily with a quiet curiosity that surprised even him. For reasons he could not fully explain, the woman standing on that windy Chicago sidewalk was not the person he had expected to see tonight. In fact, the situation unfolding in front of him was the result of a mistake, a small miscalculation in a plan that was supposed to be perfectly precise. Emily Carter was never meant to be part of his world. Yet in that moment, as the wind moved across the empty street and the city lights reflected across the polished surface of the black sedan, Adrian Romano realized that the unexpected girl standing in front of him might quietly change everything he thought he understood about control, loyalty, and the dangerous life he had built around himself. Emily Carter stood still on the sidewalk for a moment longer, trying to understand how an ordinary evening had turned into something so strange and carefully controlled. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic from Lakeshore Drive, while the tall buildings around the block reflected the glow of city lights against the dark Chicago sky. Adrian Romano observed her quietly, studying the calm strength in her posture and the confusion in her eyes. He had expected fear or panic, but Emily Carter did not react like someone who had completely lost control of the situation. Instead, she looked at him as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in the middle of her life. Adrian gave a slight nod to the men beside him, and they stepped back toward the car, leaving the space between him and Emily unusually quiet. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the measured tone of someone who chose his words with precision. He explained that she was not in danger and that what had happened was the result of a mistake that he intended to correct. The explanation sounded calm and polite, but the situation around them made it impossible for Emily to believe that everything was simple. The black sedan waiting at the curb, the confident men standing nearby, and the quiet authority in Adrian Romano's voice made it clear that he was a man who rarely faced uncertainty. Emily crossed her arms lightly against the cold October air and asked the only question that made sense to her in that moment. She asked why someone like him would need to stop her on a quiet street in Chicago. Adrian paused before answering, not because he did not have an explanation, but because he was reconsidering the plan that had brought him there in the first place. Hours earlier, he had been informed that a young woman connected to a business investigation would leave that exact bookstore around 9:30 in the evening. His people had been certain about the identification, and in Adrian Romano's world, certainty usually meant the plan would unfold smoothly. Yet the moment he looked at Emily Carter, he realized something was not correct. She did not carry the nervous energy of someone tied to financial scandals or corporate secrets. She carried the calm curiosity of someone who had simply finished a long day at work and was thinking about the train ride home. Adrian Romano had built his reputation by recognizing small details that others ignored, and this moment was no different. He could see that Emily Carter was not the person he had intended to meet tonight. Emily noticed the slight shift in his expression, the momentary calculation behind his calm exterior. For the first time, she sensed that the powerful man standing in front of her might be dealing with something unexpected. Adrian finally spoke again and admitted that there had been a misunderstanding connected to someone else with a similar name. The explanation sounded reasonable, but the circumstances still felt impossible. Emily glanced down the quiet street, noticing how empty it had become as most people had already gone home for the night. The city that normally felt alive now seemed distant and strangely quiet, as if the moment existed in a small pocket of time separate from everything else. Adrian Romano understood that leaving the situation unresolved would only create more confusion. He gestured politely toward the open door of the sedan and explained that they should continue the conversation somewhere more comfortable where he could clarify everything. The invitation was spoken with respect rather than force, but the quiet authority behind his words made it clear that he was not accustomed to hearing no. Emily Carter hesitated, looking once more at the unfamiliar man who seemed to control every movement around him. What she did not know was that Adrian Romano had already begun to question more than just a mistaken identity. For reasons he could not yet explain, the unexpected woman standing in front of him had disrupted the perfect certainty that usually guided his decisions, and that small disruption was the first sign that the carefully ordered world he controlled might soon begin to change. Emily Carter remained standing on the quiet sidewalk for a few seconds longer, her mind carefully weighing the strange reality that had unfolded around her. The wind moving through the Chicago streets carried the faint smell of rain from the direction of Lake Michigan, while the city lights reflected across the polished surface of the black sedan waiting beside the curb. Adrian Romano watched her closely but without impatience. He had spent most of his life observing people, learning how small decisions revealed the true character of someone standing in front of him. Most people in unexpected situations reacted quickly with fear or anger, but Emily Carter did something different. She paused. She thought. She studied the situation as if she was trying to understand the rules of a game she had never agreed to play. Finally, she stepped forward and entered the back seat of the sedan, not because she trusted the man beside her, but because she sensed that refusing would only deepen the confusion surrounding the night. Adrian followed her into the car, and the door closed with a soft mechanical sound that sealed them inside a quiet space separated from the outside world. The driver pulled away from the curb, and the car moved smoothly through the streets of Chicago, passing long rows of brownstone buildings and quiet storefronts already dark for the night. Emily sat near the window, watching the familiar city slowly shift into unfamiliar territory as they drove farther from the neighborhood where she lived. After several minutes, Adrian spoke again, his voice calm and steady as if he were discussing an ordinary business matter rather than the strange encounter that had just occurred. City skyline. The car slowed to a stop, and Adrian stepped out first before opening the door for Emily with quiet politeness. As she stepped onto the wide stone walkway, she realized that whatever mistake had brought her into Adrian Romano's world that evening was no longer just a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. Something about the calm certainty of the man beside her suggested that this unexpected night was only the beginning of a story neither of them had planned. Emily Carter followed Adrian Romano along the wide stone walkway toward the large house, her footsteps echoing softly in the quiet night air while the distant skyline of Chicago shimmered beyond the trees like a reminder that the familiar world still existed somewhere beyond this unexpected place. The house itself looked modern and carefully designed, with tall glass windows that reflected the soft outdoor lighting and a structure that suggested quiet wealth rather than unnecessary display. As Adrian opened the front door and gestured for her to step inside, Emily noticed that everything about the place carried the same calm precision that defined the man who owned it. The interior was warm and spacious, with high ceilings, dark wooden floors, and large windows overlooking the city lights in the distance. A faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, as if someone had been working late hours before their arrival. Emily stepped into the living room and slowly looked around, absorbing the quiet atmosphere of the house. There were bookshelves filled with carefully arranged volumes, framed photographs placed on a polished console table, and a grand piano positioned near the windows where the skyline could be seen clearly across the horizon. None of it matched the image people often imagine when they hear rumors about powerful men who control hidden networks in a large city. Adrian closed the door behind them and moved toward the center of the room with the calm confidence of someone completely at ease in his environment. He offered Emily a seat on a wide leather sofa and asked whether she would like tea or coffee. The question sounded surprisingly ordinary considering the unusual circumstances that had brought her there. Emily hesitated for a moment before sitting down, still trying to understand how a mistaken identity had led her from a quiet bookstore shift to a private residence overlooking the entire Chicago skyline. She finally accepted a cup of tea when Adrian returned from the kitchen area carrying a small tray. The simple act of serving the tea himself felt strangely sincere, as if he was making a quiet effort to remove the tension from the evening. Emily took the cup and studied the man standing across from her. Adrian Romano did not resemble the ruthless figure she might have imagined when she first heard his name. Instead, he appeared thoughtful and controlled, the kind of person who listened carefully before deciding what to say next. After a moment, Adrian sat across from her and explained that he had already confirmed the mistake with his people. The woman he had intended to meet shared a similar name and worked in the same area of the city, which had created the confusion earlier that evening. Emily listened quietly while the explanation unfolded, but her curiosity had already moved beyond the mistake itself. She found herself wondering how a man like Adrian Romano had built such an unusual world around himself, a world that seemed powerful yet strangely isolated from ordinary life. Adrian seemed to sense the question forming in her mind. He explained that his work required discretion and careful decisions because many people in Chicago relied on him to keep complicated situations under control. The way he described it sounded less like a criminal empire and more like an invisible network of agreements that allowed certain business and financial conflicts to remain quiet instead of turning into public scandals. Emily considered his words while the warm light of the room softened the shadows around them. The more she listened, the more she realized that Adrian Romano was not the unpredictable danger she had expected. He was a man who had built his life on control, strategy, and careful observation. Yet something about Emily Carter had already disrupted that control. Adrian could feel it in the small pauses between their words and in the way his attention kept returning to the quiet confidence in her voice. For the first time in many years, the perfectly organized rhythm of Adrian Romano's life felt slightly uncertain, and neither of them fully understood yet how that uncertainty would slowly begin to change everything. Emily Carter held the warm cup of tea in both hands while the quiet living room filled with the soft glow of the city lights beyond the tall windows. For several moments, neither of them spoke, and the silence did not feel uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like two strangers carefully observing the unexpected path their evening had taken. Adrian Romano leaned back slightly in the chair across from her, studying the calm expression on Emily's face. Most people who found themselves inside his house for the first time carried tension in their voices or nervousness in their movements. But Emily Carter seemed focused on understanding rather than reacting. That difference intrigued him more than he expected. After a few minutes, Emily looked up from the cup and asked a question that was simple yet direct. She asked Adrian why someone who clearly valued control and precision had allowed such a mistake to happen. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the large window overlooking the distant skyline of Chicago and looked out at the city that had shaped most of his life. The lights stretched for miles, forming a quiet pattern that reminded him how many decisions were made every night in offices and homes across the city. Finally, he spoke with a thoughtful tone that carried more honesty than he usually offered to people outside his inner circle. He explained that the world he worked in depended on information moving quickly and quietly, and sometimes even the most reliable systems could fail when one small detail was overlooked. Emily listened carefully, noticing how Adrian spoke about responsibility rather than shifting blame toward the people who had made the error. That detail revealed something important about his character. Adrian Romano was a man who expected precision not only from others, but also from himself. Emily stood slowly and walked closer to the window beside him, looking out at the same skyline he had been watching. From the hillside location of the house, the entire city appeared calm and distant, the busy streets now reduced to thin lines of light stretching across the horizon. Emily quietly mentioned that she had lived in Chicago for several years, but had never seen the city from this perspective before. Adrian turned slightly toward her and explained that the view had always helped him think clearly during complicated situations. The conversation slowly shifted into something less formal as the minutes passed. Emily spoke about the bookstore where she worked and how she enjoyed discovering new authors whose stories made ordinary days feel meaningful. Adrian listened with genuine curiosity because that kind of simple enthusiasm rarely appeared in the conversations he usually had. Most of the people around him talked about investments, influence, and negotiations that shaped financial decisions across the city. Listening to Emily describe a quiet evening organizing shelves in a bookstore felt unexpectedly refreshing. At one point, Emily laughed softly while describing a customer who had spent 20 minutes deciding between two mystery novels only to purchase both in the end. The sound of that laugh lingered in the room longer than Adrian expected. It carried a warmth that did not belong to the structured world he had built around himself. Adrian realized that the mistaken identity earlier that evening had created something far more unusual than a simple inconvenience. It had introduced a person into his carefully controlled life who did not see him as a figure of power or influence. Emily Carter saw him simply as a man standing beside her looking out at the lights of Chicago. That realization unsettled Adrian in a quiet but meaningful way. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering what his life might have looked like if it had followed a different path, one that involved ordinary conversations, late-night tea, and the quiet comfort of someone who was not impressed or intimidated by his reputation. Neither of them knew it yet, but that small shift in perspective would soon begin to change the direction of everything that followed. The quiet conversation by the window slowly faded into a thoughtful silence, while the lights of Chicago shimmered across the dark horizon like a sea of distant stars. Emily Carter remained standing near the glass, still holding the warm cup in her hands as she watched cars move along the distant highways far below. Adrian Romano stood beside her, his posture calm, but his mind more active than usual. The unexpected conversation had created a strange shift in the evening. What had begun as a simple mistake had slowly turned into something that neither of them had planned. Adrian rarely allowed unpredictable moments to remain unresolved, yet tonight he found himself allowing the conversation to continue instead of bringing the evening to a quick conclusion. After a few minutes, Emily set the empty cup down on the small table beside the window and turned toward him. With a thoughtful expression, she asked a question that most people would have been too cautious to ask. She asked Adrian whether he ever felt tired of living inside a world where every decision seemed to carry so much weight. The question surprised him because it did not sound judgmental. It sounded genuinely curious. Adrian considered the question carefully before answering. He explained that the responsibilities surrounding his life had grown gradually over many years. What began as small decisions eventually expanded into larger obligations that affected people far beyond his personal control. At some point, he had accepted that this complicated network of agreements and expectations had become the structure of his life. Emily listened quietly, studying the way he spoke with calm clarity rather than defensiveness. She could sense that Adrian Romano was accustomed to being misunderstood by people who only heard rumors about his reputation. Yet tonight he seemed willing to speak more openly than he probably intended. Emily walked slowly across the room, noticing again the rows of books that filled the tall shelves along one wall. She traced her fingers lightly across the spines of several volumes before pulling one out and glancing at the title. It was a collection of historical essays about American cities and the people who quietly shaped them from behind the scenes. Emily looked back toward Adrian with a small smile and commented that the book seemed appropriate for someone who preferred to operate outside the spotlight. Adrian allowed himself a quiet laugh at the observation. Very few people had ever described his life in such a simple way. For a moment the house felt less like a fortress protecting a powerful figure and more like a quiet place where two people could speak honestly without worrying about how their words might be interpreted. Yet as the conversation continued, Adrian noticed something that made him slightly uneasy. He realized that the evening had stretched far longer than he originally intended. The clock on the wall showed that it was already past 11:30 at night. In his usual routine, he would have already resolved the situation and arranged for Emily Carter to return home immediately. Instead, he had allowed the conversation to unfold naturally, as if the mistake earlier that evening had opened a door into a part of his life that he rarely allowed anyone to see. Adrian finally stepped toward the center of the room and spoke in a gentle but decisive tone. He explained that it was late and that he would have his driver take Emily home safely. Emily nodded in agreement because she understood that the unusual evening had reached its natural end. Yet as Adrian walked toward the front hallway to make the arrangements, he felt a quiet sense of hesitation that surprised him. The calm presence of Emily Carter had introduced something unfamiliar into his carefully controlled world. It was not chaos or danger, but something far more complicated. It was the possibility that meeting the wrong person on a quiet Chicago sidewalk might slowly begin to change the direction of his life in ways he had never considered before. Adrian Romano stepped into the hallway and spoke quietly with one of the men waiting near the entrance, instructing him to prepare the car that would take Emily Carter back to her apartment in the city. The house remained calm and quiet, but something in Adrian's expression had subtly changed since the beginning of the evening. As he returned to the living room, Emily was standing near the bookshelf again, looking at the titles arranged across the dark wooden shelves. She turned slightly when she heard his footsteps and offered a polite smile, the kind someone gives at the end of an unexpected visit that has lasted longer than planned. Adrian explained that the driver would have the car ready in a few minutes, and that the route back into the city would be quick at this hour because most of the traffic had already disappeared from the roads. Emily thanked him, and for a moment it seemed like the evening would end quietly and simply. Yet as Adrian reached for the small phone resting on the console table near the window, it vibrated with a message that immediately caught his attention. The brief notification came from someone he trusted with sensitive information, a person who rarely sent messages without a clear reason. Adrian read the message once, then again more carefully, his calm expression becoming more focused. Emily noticed the subtle change in his posture and asked if something had happened. Adrian hesitated before answering because he did not want to alarm her unnecessarily. The message explained that someone had been asking questions earlier that night about a woman who had left a bookstore on North Clark Street around 9:30. The questions had not come from ordinary sources, but from individuals connected to a rival organization that occasionally watched Adrian's movements with quiet interest. Emily listened carefully as he summarized the message without revealing too many details. The situation itself did not involve immediate danger, but it suggested that someone else had noticed the unusual events that had taken place earlier that evening. Emily folded her arms lightly and looked toward the large window overlooking the distant skyline. The calm conversation they had shared only minutes earlier suddenly felt connected to a larger and more complicated world than she had first imagined. Adrian remained thoughtful as he considered the information. He had spent years learning how small details could grow into larger problems if they were ignored. If someone had seen Emily entering the black sedan outside the bookstore, they might assume she was connected to his activities in some important way. That misunderstanding could place unnecessary attention on someone who had never intended to be involved in his world. Adrian walked slowly toward the window and stood beside Emily again, looking out across the city lights that seemed far more distant now than they had earlier in the evening. He explained that because of the questions being asked, it might be wiser for Emily to remain at the house for the rest of the night rather than returning home immediately. The suggestion was made calmly and respectfully, but the reasoning behind it carried a seriousness that Emily could clearly understand. She considered the situation carefully before answering. The logical part of her mind recognized that Adrian Romano was trying to prevent a misunderstanding from growing into something more complicated. Yet another part of her realized that agreeing to stay meant stepping one step deeper into a world she had never planned to enter. Emily finally nodded slowly and said that if it helped resolve the situation, then staying for a few hours until morning seemed reasonable. Adrian acknowledged her decision with quiet appreciation. In his life, people often followed his instructions without questioning them, but Emily Carter had approached the situation with calm reasoning instead of fear or obedience. As the night outside continued to deepen and the city lights shimmered across the horizon, Adrian understood that the unexpected meeting earlier that evening had already begun to create consequences neither of them had anticipated. The night grew quieter as the clock slowly moved past midnight, and the large house overlooking Chicago settled into a calm rhythm that felt very different from the busy streets far below. Emily Carter remained near the living room window for several minutes after Adrian Romano explained the situation, watching the distant lights while she considered how a simple evening at the bookstore had led her into a completely unfamiliar world. Adrian stepped away briefly to speak with one of the men waiting near the entrance, giving quiet instructions to ensure that no unnecessary attention would reach the property during the night. When he returned to the living room, Emily had moved toward the bookshelf again, examining the rows of books as if they were clues that might help her understand the man who owned the house. Adrian noticed the title she had chosen and smiled slightly, because it was a biography of a businessman who had quietly shaped major decisions in Chicago decades earlier. Emily commented that it seemed Adrian preferred reading about people who influenced events without standing in the spotlight. Adrian admitted that the description was accurate because in his experience the people who spoke the least often controlled the most important outcomes. The conversation continued calmly as they walked toward the kitchen where Adrian offered to make fresh coffee since the night had clearly grown longer than either of them expected. Emily accepted and leaned lightly against the counter while Adrian prepared the coffee with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to every task. The quiet sound of water filling the machine and the soft glow of the kitchen lights created an atmosphere that felt almost ordinary despite the unusual circumstances surrounding the evening. As they waited, Emily asked whether Adrian ever imagined living a different kind of life somewhere far from complicated decisions and constant attention. Adrian paused for a moment before answering, because the question touched on something he rarely considered openly. He explained that when he was younger he had believed his path would eventually become simpler, but responsibility had a way of growing slowly over time until it became the structure that defined everything around him. Emily listened thoughtfully and admitted that she had always imagined her own future as something simple and peaceful, perhaps running a small bookstore of her own someday where she could spend every day surrounded by stories and quiet conversations. Adrian found the idea unexpectedly appealing because it described a life completely different from the one he had built. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things that had nothing to do with business or influence, discussing favorite authors, childhood memories, and the strange ways that certain moments could change the direction of a person's life. At one point, Adrian looked at the clock again and realized it was nearly 2 a.m. The city outside had grown even quieter, and the distant traffic lights now appeared like small floating points across the dark horizon. Adrian explained that there was a guest room prepared upstairs where Emily could rest until morning, and that once the situation outside had settled he would arrange for her to return home without attracting unnecessary attention. Emily thanked him and followed him up the staircase, noticing how the house remained peaceful despite the complicated world connected to it. Adrian paused at the door of the guest room and assured her that she could feel completely safe there. Emily nodded with a calm expression that reflected the unusual trust that had slowly formed between them during the night. As she stepped inside and closed the door behind her, Adrian remained standing in the hallway for a moment longer than necessary. For the first time in many years, he realized that the unexpected meeting earlier that evening had created a question he could not easily answer. Somewhere between the mistaken identity, the quiet conversations, and the calm presence of Emily Carter. Something in his carefully controlled world had begun to shift in a way that no strategy or plan had predicted.